sada nam se pridružuje Raymond Ibrahim, gostujući istraživač pri Danube Institutu u Budimpešti. Raymond Ibrahim poznat je po svojim analizama odnosa Zapada i islama, kao i po upozoravanju na izazove s kojima se suočavaju kršćanske zajednice u svijetu. Gospodine Ibrahim, govornica je vaša.
Thank you. Very happy to be with you all today. It's obvious there's going to be a lot of moving back and forth in this event because we're talking about different things, and it's called TradFest, which I assume means tradition, and I'm going to be talking to you about a very ancient and old tradition amongst Christians, which has been forgotten and which is essentially defending the faith. And to understand it, we really have to go back in time in history and talk about Christianity, Christendom's original chief nemesis, which many people have forgot, which really was Islam, believe it or not. And I know this sounds hard, and I'm going to try to give you the receipts, as they say. I know this sounds difficult to believe for many people because you've been told the exact opposite for most of your life, depending on your age, probably. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, as we're talking, and based on TradFest, the idea of Christianity sort of receding, going in the background, losing faith in itself, which is to say Christians losing faith in themselves. All of that has created various symptoms. So to me, the rise and return of Islam is very much symbiotically connected to the recession and the weakening of Christianity. And I think you'll see what I mean when I get done talking a little bit about this particular tradition that we obviously have forgotten and which is needed in many ways, not just as physical defense, which is what I'm going to primarily be focusing on, but spiritual defense, cultural, civilizational defense. All of these have really collapsed, it seems, in recent years and decades, and that's why what's happening is happening. It's really interesting to note that the West is actually so much more powerful than, let's say, the Islamic world, and yet at the same time it is suffering from it constantly, okay? And that doesn't make any sense. So that's just by way of some preliminary thoughts, but just so let's for starters clarify history, because like I said, this is my primary field, and it really surprises me to see how often it's the exact opposite, and I'll tell you how it became the exact opposite. So the tradition of Islam in the West, let's go back in time. Islam, according to the traditional rendering, basically starts in the year 622 with Muhammad in Arabia, and he preaches, I'm sure you know, jihad, which gets translated as holy war. And already the confusion starts because you've been hearing, no, jihad means something else. It means fighting the self, you know. But no, it was actually holy war. That was the exact and only way it was understood. And right from the beginning, after Arabia was consolidated, most people don't know this, but if you talked about the Christian world at the time of Muhammad in the 7th century, the majority of it is in those countries which we today call the Muslim world, okay? So that would be all of North Africa, from Egypt in the east all the way to Morocco, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, and the Middle East, okay, which would be the modern states of Syria, Lebanon, Israel, PA territories, Jordan, Iraq, and of course Asia Minor, which is what we call Turkey. So not only were those regions Christian, they were actually more Christian than Europe in the 7th century, okay? And people are not aware of this. It's kind of interesting because they seem to think those areas were somehow always Islamic, and if not Islamic, somehow Eastern and different. No, there was actually a deep continuity between the North Africa and what we call the Middle East and Europe, okay? The Mediterranean was known as a Roman lake at that time, and there was, you know, Egypt, for example, for almost 1,000 years was Hellenistic, with Greek being the primary language. When you talk about a lot of the church fathers who are Greek, a great majority of them are actually from Egypt and from Syria, and of course Asia Minor. St. Augustine, who's apparently the father of Western theology, was really a Berber from Tunisia. So keep that in mind. That's what the world looked like. That's what the Christian world looked like in the 7th century. And keep it in mind also because there's a lesson there that something that was so profoundly Christian could become what it is today, the heart of the Islamic world. So how did that happen? Well, it happened through violence, conquest. And long story short, this is my field. I've written books about this if you're interested, but I'm giving you the digested version. So from the year of Muhammad's death in 632 to 732, which is the year of the Battle of Tours in Poitiers in the middle of France, that whole region got conquered, that ancient Christian region, as well as Spain. Okay, Spain, of course, another older Christian territory. And so at that point, you have Islam in all that area, conquering in the heart of, in France now. And then you get various emanations of this. So this is the first wave, but then other waves come and other peoples become Muslims. So the originals are the Arabs, and then later on you get the Turks, and they become the new standard bearers, basically, of the jihad. And if you really look at the text the way I have, including in the original sources and languages, this was really seen as a jihad. Today, historians who talk about these battles and wars, they'll talk about Arabs and Turks and Mongols, Tatars, Berbers, Moors, but they don't really tell you the overarching glue that propelled all these people, which was they saw themselves first and foremost as Muslims, and they thought this was their holy duty, which it was in Islam, a jihad, bringing Islam and Islamic control all around the world. So that happens, and that goes on, and then the rise of the Turks come, and then you get all of Asia Minor gets conquered. Okay, so now we're talking literally 3/4 of what was once the Christian world is now conquered and absorbed. Europe, the West, really became what it known as the West because it was the westernmost appendage of all that Christian world that was conquered. And it really became a final bastion of Christianity. It had to fight to the death. Otherwise, it would have been snuffed out and conquered just like the rest. And this is interesting because we come to the concept of warfare and Christianity, because there's apparently nowadays a lot of people, I use this word, I call it doormat Christianity, and it seems to me it's the prevalent form of Christianity in the West, which is basically, if you want to be a good Christian, then you just behave like a doormat and you never challenge anyone, you don't stand in anyone's way, you don't judge, you don't condemn, you're a doormat. Okay, well, that doesn't seem to me to be how Jesus behaved, because he also whipped people and hurled tables, so there's definitely a time for everything, a time for war and a time for peace, as the Bible itself says. But the Christians had no compunction at this point fighting back, and they did it again in the concept of just war theory, which I won't get into, but of course that has the deepest roots in the Catholic tradition, as we know, and it is in fact just. But to just give you an idea of how horrific this sort of thing is and the lies, if you look at Spain today, the way it's taught in colleges, you'll hear about the Golden Age and how Islam brought knowledge and wonders and technology and all this sort of thing. Much better historians than myself, who are from Spain, have written books in Spanish and in Portuguese completely debunking this and showing you that in fact what Spain was essentially a microcosm of what I just described, which is the long Islamic war on essentially Christian nations. So if you look at that country, literally after it got conquered in the year 711, as part of that long continuum I told you about before they entered in France, it took it 7 to 8 years, centuries, 700 to 800 years fighting Muslims back, because after Islam, the Iberian Peninsula fell, a few Christians were holed up in the northwest quadrants of the peninsula, and from there the Reconquista began. And that literally took 7 centuries of extreme bloodshed, violence. Think about ISIS, pyramids of heads, crucifixions. That was what was going on. That's what the Muslims were doing against the Christians as they tried to reassert and reclaim their territory. And again, to really emphasize to you just how warped things have become, that same nation now, Spain, after having spent 7 centuries of this, last I heard is they just gave a blanket check to like 500,000 or 1 million migrants from Africa, okay? So clearly we can say those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it in very graphic ways, all right? But also it's important to note and to emphasize that during this long war that what went on from Islam against Christianity and the only rebuttal really is the First Crusade, which people are so freaked out about. But to give you an idea, that it also had hostility for Christianity. So again, this wasn't just warfare to conquer and whatever, you can have your religion. No, this was very much rooted to Islamic doctrine and teaching, which is about subjugating the other and putting them in their place. Excuse me. So all throughout these centuries that I'm discussing, wherever the Muslims would conquer a Christian region, it would be very par for the course for churches to be attacked and destroyed. The nice ones would be transformed into mosques, okay? Christians would be killed haphazardly, especially if they dared resist. Women and children abducted, enslaved, raped, okay? And that was now, but the hostility for Christianity, okay, what I described as normal warfare attack on people, it was always there because there was always this thing about desecrating churches and statues of Jesus and breaking crosses and all that sort of thing. It's from the beginning all the way on to, well, up until we saw with ISIS and groups like that. But to give you one idea, in the year 1009, the Fatimid Caliph Hakim Bamrullah, who was based in Egypt, destroyed, according to the Muslim source historian Al-Makrizi, 30,000 churches in Egypt and Syria, which on the one hand, again, underscores just how profoundly Christian that region was before Islam did what it did, and also how bad the persecution was. He also destroyed the Holy Sepulchre Church. Not a lot of people know that, but the original one was destroyed by him. And then a smaller one was rebuilt. And then that one started to be attacked as well in that same century, the 11th century, which finally led to the First Crusade. And right before the First Crusade, you had people, the Turks were running amok, and especially in Asia Minor. And the sources I've looked at, especially Armenians, we know about the Armenian genocide. In fact, yesterday was, I think, the Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day. But most people don't know that the genocide really began 1,000 years ago at the hands of the Turks, when they started pouring into Greater Armenia and East Asia Minor and all the way up into the West. And according to the sources, such as Matthew of Edessa, who was a contemporary, literally tens of thousands of Christians were being butchered, many more enslaved. One city, Ani, I think it was the capital at the time, was known as the city of 1,001 churches. Each church was systematically desecrated and destroyed, and most of them actually burned to the ground. So the point is that it's not just, this is an ancient foe who isn't just attacking for property or for material reasons, it's for idealistic religious reasons as well. Okay, the Quran, for all the talk that there's some sort of connection or brotherly love that can occur between Muslims and Christians, it flat out says, it denies the Trinity. It flat out says that they who believe Jesus is the Son of God are infidels, kuffar, and if you are that, well, according to Islam, you should either be killed or subjugated or forced into Islam. That is exactly what it says. You can see Quran 9:5. Quran 9:29 says to fight Christians, people of the book, Jews as well, until they pay tribute and feel themselves subdued and oppressed as second-class citizens. And there's a whole long tradition of all that sort of thing. So the point is, the war was ongoing nonstop. It had all sorts of different manifestations. The Mediterranean islands were, of course, all conquered in this early stage. Earlier historians, such as Henry Pirenne, French historian, Pirenne. He wrote Charlemagne and Muhammad, and his thesis was very interesting because he basically traced and said the Dark Ages was a complete product of Islam, which makes absolute sense. Because what I just told you, this mass sundering of Christendom in half by swallowing up the southern half, south of the Mediterranean, created a massive trauma basically for Europe, which was now like the little brother, the little Christian left on its own, okay, which had just recently been a few centuries earlier conquered by barbarians who had by this time, of course, been Christian. But so that's according to his thesis, which was very popular but has also been suppressed in later years. That is what caused the Dark Ages. So interesting that Islam had created the Dark Ages. But then it's hard to even stop because I'm giving you just randomly different episodes of violence by Muslims. But there was also the slave trade. And this was one of the more famous, because we have good documentation, is Barbary. Barbary would be North Africa, Algeria, these nations. They were Muslims, and they thrived exclusively on enslaving Christians, Europeans. And they went everywhere, as far as Iceland. So no one was too distant or too remote for them to get to. They went to Iceland and came back with hundreds of slaves, we know at least one time. Also in Ireland and other different regions. And we also know for a fact that in the 16th century, they had 1.25 million slaves from Europe. Okay, we don't hear about that for some reason when we hear about slavery, which is a little odd. And then, of course, I've left the best for last, because you all know it, the Ottomans and the Balkans. So I won't wax too much on that, but that would be probably the most ferocious, the longest lived, because the rise of the Ottomans is early 1400s, late 1300s actually, with Usman. And it goes on, and the wars and the annexation, the fall of Constantinople in 1453, of course, that's the most iconic moment of this massive jihad. But of course, there's all sorts of other battles. Croatia, of course, knows its role, holding the line as well, being at this crack fault with the Ottomans on one side, and all these wars, which go on, incidentally, speaking of the Ottomans, their high point is in it comes in 1683. So I already told you, the fall of Constantinople, 1453. So this is now well over 200 years later, and now they're surrounding Vienna. Okay, that's how far they've gone. So imagine all these areas I'm telling you about the map. All of North Africa, all of the Middle East, Asia Minor, all of which were Christian. Spain conquered into France, and then now they're in Vienna. Okay, so I've actually put together a map, and if you look at it, and I colored the areas that were attacked, it's almost all of Europe was attacked. Rome was attacked in 846 by Saracen pirates from North Africa. Okay, so no one really escaped. It was always seen as ideological, and just to really emphasize it, even the United States of America's very first war as a nation, after it had gained independence from Britain, was with Muslims, acting the same way and saying the same things. And I'm talking about the Barbary Wars. Again, the same fellows that were enslaving Europeans. In 1683, I'm sorry, not in 1683, almost in the late 1700s, after independence, they started attacking American vessels and sailors, enslaving them, torturing them, doing horrific things to them. And then finally, we have a very telling letter, which I enjoy quoting at length, by Thomas Jefferson, the United States' third president, and author of the Declaration of Independence, the paragon of enlightenment. So he and John Adams met with one of Barbary's ambassadors, a Muslim man by the name of Abdullah. And then Jefferson wrote in a letter to Congress what came of their parley, what came of their meeting. Jefferson, of course, is trying to recover the enslaved Americans and also put an end to hostilities. Okay, so Jefferson writes to Congress the following, quote, "We took the liberty to make some inquiries concerning the grounds of their, Barbary's, pretensions to make war upon nations who had done them no injury. And we observed that we considered all mankind as our friends, who had done us no wrong, nor had given us any provocation." So basically Jefferson just said, let's be friends. We're open to working with you. There's no need for this hostility. Now look at what the ambassador told him. He continues, Jefferson, quote, "The ambassador answered us that it was founded on the laws of their prophets, that it was written in their Quran, that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise." And this is in a letter we have March 28, 1786. Now, isn't that remarkable? That sounds like ISIS. It sounds like a radical Muslims, the ones that don't represent Islam, right? And yet here this guy is saying exactly what they said. And I could tell you also all the earlier attacks that I mentioned, all throughout Europe and in the Middle East and North Africa, were again justified by this same rationale. That our Quran, our Prophet command us to do this, you're the enemy. And this is how it has to be, okay? And now really to underscore the role of the tradition of fighting, Islam, that was amongst the West, and how it was a life or death kind of thing. And speaking of American presidents, I just gave you Jefferson. Now let me give you Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, who was the 26th president of the United States, and a very well and accomplished historian himself. He died around 1919. But look at what he wrote. Quote, "Christianity was saved in Europe solely because the peoples of Europe fought. If the peoples of Europe in the 7th and 8th centuries, and on up to and including the 17th century, so for 1,000 years, had not possessed a military equality with, and gradually a growing superiority over the Mohammedans, who invaded Europe, Europe would at this moment be Mohammedan, and the Christian religion would be exterminated. Wherever the Mohammedans have had complete sway, wherever the Christians have been unable to resist them by the sword, Christianity has ultimately disappeared. That's a very accurate way to put it. Of course, you won't find presidents talking this way anymore because they're politically correct. But that, in a nutshell, is really the story of Islam and the West, that it basically grew as a hostile movement, really in contradistinction to Christian principles, one can argue. That its warfare always was underscored by religious hostility, and it was expressed itself in the ways that I told you, including destruction of churches, subjugation of Christians, mockery of their icons and symbols, and that sort of thing. And it went on in perpetuity, okay? And it was only because, it's ironic to me, because what we call the colonial era, if you talk now, I don't know about here, but in the United States, if you talk about Muslims have grievances, the whole world has grievances because of the colonial era, because of what Europeans did, because they entered into Africa, Asia, and they killed everyone, and they were horrible, and so forth. What's interesting and what's missing from this is if you really look at the colonial era, it really, parts of it started, again, in response to Muslims. France, when it started going into Algeria, it was because of the Algerian slave trade and the Muslims there who were, as I was telling you, enslaving vessels, including the United States and so forth. So that's what brought it, and to a lot of Europeans back in that day, they weren't necessarily crusaders, but they understood the old logic that, we're fighting back, and they also knew this was formerly Christian territory. Okay, so that was what happened, and believe it or not, if you look at the colonial era, it's not that now they tell you that's what Muslims are upset about. It's actually the opposite. During the colonial era is when Muslims more or less lost faith in Islam and became, if you want, westward looking. And you can see this, the perfect example is what happened in Turkey. Ottoman Turkey, which, as I said, was the scourge of Europe for centuries, was the first one to turn its back on religion, jettison Islam, adopt the Roman alphabet, get rid of the Arabic alphabet, and become highly secular under Ataturk. Why is that? Well, because I think from the start, Islam, or the Muslim peoples, gravitate towards this creed because it's the strong horse, as they say. And people want to follow the strong horse. But when they realized it wasn't, and the West was actually assertive and confident in its ways, and coming in and taking over, and bringing with it all sorts of boons and technology and medicine, learning, they started, despite themselves losing faith in Islam. Many people don't realize this because we get a different narrative. We're told that this is when they were upset. That's the new narrative. It's actually now the opposite. You know when Muslims start to turn back towards Islam? It's when the West actually loses its own faith in itself. I give it the loose time, I'd say in the 1960s, all right, with the rise of that sort of mentality and permissiveness and decline of Christianity. That's when you find Muslims very much they grow disgusted of Western culture. One of the prime examples is Sayyid al-Qutb, an Egyptian. He became the Muslim Brotherhood's chief theoretician. And he went to America in the 1950s to learn, and he was flabbergasted and shocked to see men and women consorting, okay, by 50 standards. And so he was one of many who came up with the idea that these Western people, we can appropriate and learn from them technology and science and whatever, but we want nothing to do with their culture. It's corrupt, it's depraved. So what happened? They fell back on Islam, okay, and Islam became the default. So we use their science and technology, but we govern ourselves culturally, civilizationally, according to Islamic principles. So that's this story of Islam in the West. That is the old ancient tradition between these two groups. One was violent, one conquered, one actually fought back, did the best it could, and eventually prevailed. And now Islam is coming back in the guise of, let's say, Muslim migration in Europe, which is a major issue, especially in the Western Europe, of course. Nations like France and the UK, Germany, but other countries as well are getting these large numbers of Muslim migrants. Many of them come bringing the sorts of mentality. Okay, you're the infidel, you exist for me to plunder, rape, do whatever. So we see that is happening. And, but the bottom line is you have to understand the difference, and this is what I was trying to say earlier, is a lot of people, it's very common nowadays to say Muslims are invading Europe. Well, no, that is absolutely incorrect. They're not invading, they're being invited. That's the difference. The history I told you about, Europeans did everything they could to fight back. Now, this is what I was saying, now Europe is much more powerful than the Islamic world, technologically, economically, even militarily. So why is it losing? Back when, the times that I was telling you about, including the Crusades and before the Crusades, Europe was actually the weaker of compared to the massive Muslim world. But it really fought, to the death to continue. Now it's so powerful, but it's being terrorized by just because it can't even create policies that are rational. And so I think that really sums it up in the end, which is that basically because the West has lost its purpose. I mean, look at what we call it, the West. What other civilization is known by a direction? We don't really have much of an identity. We're a direction, okay? And it's not something to fight and die for, is it? A direction. There's Islamic civilization, there's Hindu civilization, Chinese, but then there's the West, which is very interesting in and of itself. So I think until such time that the West manages to reassert its Christian identity, publicly especially, not just privately, and also reject this fabricated historical amnesia, okay? Because like I said, those who forget history are certainly doomed to repeat it, and that is in fact what's happening in Europe. And of course, most importantly, to defend free speech on these topics, okay? This is not hate speech. The new game is when someone like me talks about what I'm talking about. I'm just giving you historical facts. To call it hate speech is just a very cynical way of just shutting it down, and people should definitely be cognizant about that. And the bottom line is civilizations that believe in themselves, which in this case actually Islam does, survive, and those that don't, well, they disappear. So I think it's time to resuscitate the traditional way of the Christian world. Thank you.